So do you enjoy using named characters in Warhammer 40K, or do you prefer the generic picks and commanders for your chapter or faction? Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought we'd talk about named versus generic characters, and whether or not people like specific named entities running around their battlefields, or they want to forge a narrative for their own guys. In Warhammer 40k, it's basically long been the case that you can both have either generic or named characters. Generic characters perhaps being things like, say, a standard Space Marine captain or Eldar Farseer, not associated with any one individual in the lore and could represent a whole load of characters out there in the 41st millennium, and they often come with a bit of a choice of war gear, or you could give them other upgrades like enhancements. In 10th edition, named characters have been rebranded Epic Heroes, and these tend to be the guys who are literally just one entity or individual, such as Eldrad Ulthran, the Eldari Farseer of Ulthwé, Marneus Calgar, or Abaddon the Despoiler. For obvious reasons, you can only field one of them per army, as obviously the Imperium doesn't have multiple Marneus Calgars to throw into the fight. Not every single army has them. For example, Genestealer Cults and Chaos Knights don't have any named characters whatsoever, and a few armies are very, very light on them. In the past, it's often been a discussion point as to how much people actually enjoy using those versus generic characters. I thought I'd run a quick channel poll before making this video. It looks like for 2,500 votes for you guys, people tend to prefer using generic characters over named epic heroes, at least when they can. I guess a little bit might have been skewed by the votes of people's armies that don't have access to them, but in general the majority of the major factions in 40k at least have some. It definitely seems like there's an overall preference to using more generic characters that you can customize and make your own lore for, though it's by no means ubiquitous. A third of people liked their name heroes on the board as the primary focus of attention. I feel like named characters have often been a discussion point due to 40k's past, going back really quite a long time in the game right now. In say things like, I think it was 2nd and 3rd edition, named characters needed your opponent's permission to use them in game, and often as a result they weren't allowed in tournament play type things, and maybe has a little bit of parity with how Forge World used to be treated in that regard. I'd guess that the motivation at that point was that these named characters can bring really quite crazy abilities to the board, and maybe they aren't as intended for game balance, though I feel like it's hardly the biggest deal in the world given just how much crazy and unbalanced stuff there was in the game back then. 40k was certainly in its infancy, and any idea of things like balance updates or sort of tracking stats and things wasn't really quite as big a thing. I feel like as a bit of a hangover for that, there's often been a little bit of questioning about people relying too heavily on named characters, even if in reality those rules are buried very long in the past at this point. I just feel like I occasionally see it in anecdotes of people feeling like named characters can be too much and not wanting to play against them so much, even if I don't really think that that's the main reason that people tend to prefer generic characters these days, at least according to that poll. In 10th edition though, times have certainly moved on since then. They're pretty well ubiquitous and often kind of essential to the way that certain armies function in game. Quite a few named characters are basically auto-include in optimized lists, such as say Magnus for the Thousand Sons, Angron for the World Eaters, or Grandmaster Azrael for the Dark Angels. Characters that are either so strong or so intrinsic to the functioning of the army that it's basically never a bad idea to bring them along. I feel like in this day and age, named characters specifically don't usually get to be a major discussion point from an all-round game balance point of view, not trying to exclude them as a class in any case. They are often strong, but there's plenty of weak ones as well. A few of them are auto-include, but then quite a lot of generic characters are auto-include for their given armies as well. And Games Workshop does redress balance of them. If anything gets too out of hand, they can attract nerfs if they're leading their army to too much of a success. Over the past decade or so, Games Workshop really seems to have pushed to normalise them and just see them as normal parts of the army that you can collect and play with. Obviously, a lot of these are really cool miniatures desired by a lot of people, but I feel like it works out quite well for Games Workshop as well. I think in recent times they've really tried to expand the options of different specific character sculpts for certain armies, trying to give armies a big roster of characters that look a bit different to each other, whether or not they're actual named characters, or unique generic support characters like the Genestealer Cult and their huge cast worth of support models. I feel like named characters maybe add to that. So for example, a Space Marine collector who collected Ultramarines, they might have a regular captain and a Gravis captain, but they can also buy Uriel Ventris, Cato Sicarius and Marneus Calgar as well, potentially meaning that you could sell more models, partly due to the fact that all these different units have different rules in game, despite things like the regular captain, Uriel Ventris and Cato Sicarius having at least fairly similar war gear. Kind of interesting that they also do still charge their named character tax versus their regular models. Often named characters just get slapped with a slightly higher price tag, such as say the difference between Typhus's price, which is $3 more than say the Lord of Virulence, which would be another equivalent Death Guard on model and Terminator armor. I think perhaps one of the more common criticisms people tend to have of named characters being such an integral part of 40k's gameplay right now is maybe the shift of scope between a sort of narrow narrative of just a few big players versus the theoretical vast galaxy that you have out there. I feel like the shift a bit maybe sort of mirrors the way that Games Workshop has treated the 40k lore over the past 20 years or so, basically gradually moving it forward from being a sort of static setting where you explore battles and ideas happening in obscure corners of the galaxy, and named characters with miniatures might show up as part of one given campaign, but that being an unusual idea, as opposed to the more current lore format, where you have a bit of a progressive storyline, and it often devolves into a bit of hero hammer. Say with Arcs of Omen, for example, where we have Vashtor wandering around, and then he gets to fight Azrael, but Be'lakor stops him, and then later in the narrative they lure Azrael and Dante down to the new demon world, and then ambush them with Angron, but the lion winds up stopping him. At least for the centerpiece events of Warhammer 40k, it often tends to be very focused around these named individuals interacting. I feel like maybe the tabletop game has shifted a bit more in favour of that as well. Say for example, if you're playing with like somewhat optimised Dark Angels and Thousand Sons list, there's a good chance that you might have Grandmaster Azrael being facing off against Magnus in multiple different battles. There's definitely a whole load of positives having named characters as big central focal points that you know their lore and backstory of, but maybe does feel a bit jarring when you have a theoretically massive galaxy with all sorts of conflicts raging on a number of fronts, many of which unknown to the Imperium at large. You somehow manage to keep on winding up running into the exact same bloke who seems to be commanding every single Space Marine army or every single Thousand Sons force. I feel like it maybe does feel a little bit odd when named characters die in game as well, such as say if you casually obliterate Ghazghkull Thraka with some enormous amounts of heavy firepower, or Rabute Gilliman winds up getting chopped in half by a Chaos Knight and its Chain Cleaver. Those sort of events will be kind of momentous in the lore, but because you're just playing with the miniatures in game, you just get to pick them up back afterwards, and they're fine for the next battle. I guess for most of them you could just say they're injured or forced to retreat or something like that, and plenty of epic heroes do have good reason to live, die and live again, such as Angron with his Yokon reality, or the Tyranid Swarm Lords who can be manifested at a time of stress for the High Fleet, that maybe is a little bit at odds with the 40k lore. How these characters just seem to be able to wade through war zones and come up against the worst of the enemy and then somehow arrive unscathed due to their plot armor and having current miniatures on sale, but then in game they can be hacked down pretty brutally and quickly. Maybe the flip side of not expecting to see quite as many named characters in random 40k conflicts is the fun of building your own lore for your own named characters and things. I feel like that's the other major thing that really draws people to want to use their own generic characters as opposed to falling back on Games Workshop's named ones. You get to have a bit more creativity with your own stories. Say for example, this is your own Chaos Warband, this is your Warlord and his motivations, trying to seek and destroy Imperial strongholds and get a kill tally for Khorne or something like that, versus maybe the slightly more preset lore of this is Abaddon the Despoiler and he's going around doing his own thing, doing his Black Crusades. It maybe ties in a bit with trying to make your own narrative for your whole army as well. If you made a cool sub-faction, like your own custom chapter or Imperial Guard regiment or something, it might just make a bit less sense to have the actual named characters show up to the fight. Maybe not a lot of good reason that the actual Tigurius would show up to a random successor chapter of the Ultramarines, at least not for the course of all of their fighting history. So it can just mean that from a narrative point of view, using named characters as with their own models and representing them in the lore just doesn't make quite as much sense. On the other hand though, if you still want to use the datasheet or use even the base of the model in your army, it can be really quite fun as an excuse to kit bash something unique to represent them though. For example, for my broadly Cadian themed Imperial Guard, here are my proxies for Gunnery Sergeant Harker and Iron Hand Strachan, not using the same models or the same sort of styling but trying to show their war gear kind of nicely, and can be a fun little excuse to convert something unique, or even just take the base model of the one that you were converting from and add your own different flair to it, making it so they've still got basically the same sort of overall look and war gear, but then adding your own chapter or regiment's personality. Can be kind of fun as well if you just want to have your own chapter master basically have some next level rules or threat. You could say create your own chapter master completely kit bashed and just say that he uses the rules and datasheet for Manius Calgar if the weapons are somewhat equivalent. I think quite a lot of people like the idea of generic characters for a sort of gameplay and customization point of view. Named characters almost always tend to have their war gear and their special rules completely locked down without really any big scope to changing them, whereas the generic characters can pick their own war gear and also sometimes have combos on the go with things like enhancements. I say outside of things like Crusade, the rules for doing this in 10th edition don't tend to be quite as deep as 9th edition and before. I feel like Games Workshop maybe shied away a bit from things like combinations of warlord traits and relics, which could often produce some slightly janky combos, say combining a good durability relic with a good damage relic to make an overall all-round powerhouse character, where the sum is a lot greater than the individual parts. In 10th edition though, they've basically locked things down to individual enhancements that you can't mix and match, in an effort to try and make those enhancements a bit more clearly worth the points that they're given, as opposed to when they combine together make something rather unholy and overpowered. It is maybe a bit of a shame for character customization though, I think. I feel like creating those combos and making a warlord a massive threat and weirdly dangerous could be kind of fun. I do quite like the way though that plenty of abilities and options can't actually be found on the epic heroes. They're usually no longer just directly better versions of the generic characters. Say for example the free stratagems that you get on things like Space Marine Captains or Necron Overlords. The named Space Marine Captains or Necron Overlords like Imhotep the Stormlord don't get a direct free stratagem rule, they have it replaced by other things. Sometimes better or sometimes worse depending on what the specific one is, but at least it's different, and maybe helps with them feeling not just like they're directly better but cost more points as they often did before. At least for optimized lists though, it's never really going to make sense to arbitrarily lock out options and not allow yourself to use some named characters or epic heroes if they're really quite strong. I feel like this does vary massively from faction to faction though. Some armies like Thousand Sons with Magnus and Ahriman often want to be using their named characters in literally every list, and they're generally agreed on to be the strongest way to play those armies, whereas a few more are a bit more borderline and you can certainly get by without. Even if it does look like the majority of people do prefer to play with generic characters as opposed to named ones on the whole, I certainly wouldn't diminish the fact that they do have some really quite big positives. They can add loads of theme to a force as cool focal points with a good backstory, where Games Workshop can potentially create some slightly more brave and out there models that aren't trying to represent all sorts of different generic characters. They can be quite good for sub-faction theming in particular. Say for example, having a Salamander's character leading your Space Marine force really helps cement it as being on theme for that chapter, as opposed to just some generic Space Marines painted green. I feel like those sort of miniatures do quite well when they're leading their armies, maybe dictating the character of the force a little bit. I feel like actually having lots of named characters as the sort of viewpoints for seeing the 40k galaxy from does make a lot of sense from the lore though, and make 40k a bit more relatable. Games Workshop develops the backstories of a bunch of these named characters over the course of multiple different lore sources and campaigns and occasionally novels and things. And even if there might be some sort of ancient Xenos or homicidal maniac killing machine, you can still broadly understand them and how they're likely to react to any given situation. And perhaps that means that there's just a little bit less new work needed to establish what they're going to do when they get into an individual war zone or something. A lot of people will already broadly understand that character and where they're coming from their backstory. So maybe you can put a bit more focus into the new situation that they're on and telling the stories of the conflicts a little bit more. They definitely have a bit of excitement value as well. If say you have a new player who wants to collect World Eaters, I feel like most of the time they are going to be excited to add the big scary demon Primarch himself to the army, or to add in a fun maniacal character like Khan the Betrayer. Perhaps just being obvious and exciting picks to people who aren't as enormously invested in going really deep with the backstory and customization of their army. I want to maybe feel the core archetype of their faction as Games Workshop seems to have developed it, as it's just quite cool as it is. In any case though, I'd be interested to hear your guys' thoughts on this. Do you prefer to use named characters or generic characters in your games of 40k, and why? Look forward to hearing your thoughts down in the comments. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep all the videos coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.